beaches, coral reefs, and swaying palms are the attributes most commonly associated with Australian islands, but those landing upon the shores of the country's newly christened islet are more likely to see penguins than palm trees. That's because Crocodile Island, Rhino Island, and Uranus Island, which are amongst 17 new islands to be added to Australia's territory this week, lie in the icy depths of Antarctica. They form part of the Australian Antarctica Territory, which is the largest territory on a continent claimed by any one nation. Other countries with territorial claims over Antarctica include Britain, France, Norway, Argentina, Chile, and New Zealand, with a large portion of this frozen landmass still unclaimed. But despite competing claims to Antarctica, the continent simultaneously belongs to nobody and everyone.
I'm on an island near the North Pole, and I'm here to find out who owns the Arctic.
As the ice melts more and more in this region,
you can see just how dramatic the ice has been shrinking.
One of these countries has shown that they're willing to fight for it.
Russia is making a new push into the Arctic.
I mean, this is the Wild West.
Investment opportunities opening up in sort of an unusual area, the Russian Arctic.
The Arctic region has strategic and economic importance.
The pace of melting is only getting faster.
Russia projecting its power
because Norway is bordering
Arctic border with Russia.
The Russian Arctic.
To use diplomacy to avoid further conflict in the high north.
So I'm not allowed to take my camera down into the mines, so I've been given this explosion-proof, super fortified camera in case it explodes. It won't cause a death fire for the entire community. So this coal mine is owned by the Russian government. It's in a town with Russian flags and the bust of a Russian communist revolutionary, Vladimir Lenin. But this isn't Russia. It's Barentsburg, on the island of Svalbard, near the North Pole. It's a place that exists for strategic reasons, not for making money. In fact, it loses money, has for decades.
Ну, не секрет, да, что все знают, что здесь особая хозяйственная деятельность по добыче угля, она не приносит, да, каких-то доходов больших. Это понятно.
Russia funds this place because for them it means influence in this region, a frozen ocean that is melting more and more every year due to the changing climate. This is what the Arctic Ocean looked like in September 1984. Fast forward 32 years, and this is what it looks like, September 2016. Most of the world sees this as a looming disaster. But for the Arctic nations, this change means an opportunity, access to a brand new ocean. Here's what geologists think oil and gas resources might look like in the Arctic. The US Geological Survey estimates that the region holds 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas and 13% of its oil. These resources are still remote and costly to access, but they're more accessible every year, and suddenly this desolate region is very interesting to the world. New shipping routes are also opening up. And this ocean that was once frozen is now navigable for longer periods every summer, cutting weeks off the trips between Asian and Western markets. The topic of borders in the Arctic region is a little bit complex, and it's an issue that's still open for discussion and negotiation. Currently, the border lines in the Arctic Ocean look like this. Every country gets their default maritime borders that are 200 nautical miles off their coast. The rest of the water that doesn't fall within these exclusive economic zones is up for grabs to anyone who can prove that it belongs to them. And that has a lot to do with a continental shelf. A continental shelf is a part of a country's landmass. It's just covered with ocean. The continental shelf continues until it drops off into the deeper parts of the ocean. Since the ice has been melting, countries have been sending out submarines to gather data on their continental shelf. They put together a scientific case and submit it to a UN committee. This committee reviews it and decides whether or not the country's claim is scientifically valid.
Extending from our coastlines, lying beneath the sea, is an extension of our country called the continental shelf. It determines the new borders of our country. Knowing where the edge of the continental shelf lies adds millions of square kilometers to our country and makes the resources on the seafloor and beneath the seabed Canada's.
So far, Norway and Iceland are the only two nations whose continental shelf claims have been submitted and approved by the UN. But others have submitted claims that are waiting for approval. Look at Russia's claims versus that of Greenland, the large Arctic island that actually belongs to Denmark. The claims overlap significantly. Canada is in the process of gathering data and is expected to submit a claim that will also have some overlap here. The UN committee that evaluates these claims is made up of scientists, not diplomats. Their sole job is to say whether or not the claim is scientifically valid. It's then up to the countries to negotiate how to work out who gets what. Russia has shown its interest in having a claim that extends all the way to the North Pole.
In 2007, Russia went so far as to plant its flag on the seafloor under the North Pole.
And if push comes to shove, Russia likely won't concede its North Pole claim to the tiny nation of Denmark, whose claims overlap with theirs.
Russia is easily the biggest player in the Arctic neighborhood. Half of the Arctic is flanked by Russian coast, and they easily wield the most influence, and they have the most to gain from global warming and the ice melting. And so they're refortifying and renovating a lot of their strategic outposts here in the Arctic.
50 airfields by 2020, putting special forces, they're training, holding military exercises in the Arctic.
In recent years, Russia has been reopening, fortifying, and building new military bases in the Arctic region. They've been publicizing their military exercises, which include reindeer, huskies, and soldiers in uniforms that look like they belong in a Star Wars film.
Russia is sending us important signals that in the Arctic, they will project their own power and capabilities. And I don't see a sufficient response from the US and NATO to recognize that increased military position.
One of those outposts is the town of Barentsburg, which is right behind me, here on the island of Svalbard.
Barentsburg isn't a military facility like all those other dots on the map, but it serves a similar purpose. And to understand why Russia wants a town on this island, you have to understand Svalbard. It's unlike any other piece of land on Earth, and not only because it's the northernmost inhabited part of the planet. The Svalbard Treaty, signed in 1920, says that any country who has signed the treaty can have its people on Svalbard and exploit the land for commercial or economic purposes. The land technically belongs to Norway, but 45 countries have signed the treaty, and so 45 countries have economic claim to this land. The one rule is that no nation, including Norway, is allowed to have military assets on Svalbard. So Russia set up a coal mine up here, not to make money. Russia pays for these coal miners to be here to sink economic roots into this land. If there's ever a dispute about boundaries, or if oil is someday found off the shores of Svalbard, Russia will be at the table where those discussions are happening, and Barentsburg will be their bargaining chip. It's their claim to this land.
What's most fascinating to me is that this strategy plays out with people. The people living here in Barentsburg are effectively placeholders for a Russian strategy for the Arctic. And yet, when you talk to them, that's not really on their mind.
Политическая составляющая нас интересует поскольку больше о работе. В основном люди сюда приезжают для того, чтобы заработать деньги.
They're not thinking about geopolitics, they're not thinking about the changing landscape of the Arctic and what that means for Russian policy.
Вообще, не касаюсь, не думаю, не разговариваю, не обсуждаю.
For Russia, coal has been their main economic activity. It's what they've been doing here for years. But coal is in decline and their operation is slowly losing people and interest. And so they're realizing they have to pivot to a different economic activity that is more sustainable for the future. And for them, the answer is tourism.
On Svalbard, it's kind of clear that coal mining era is something which is, disappearing. It's a bust. Tourism, science, nature protection, it's future.
You can see Russia's renewed interest in this island taking place when you walk around the town of Barentsburg.
The consulate is undergoing some renovation right now. They're like gutting the whole thing and renovating after years of neglect. It's a small village of a few hundred people and it has an entire consulate. This consulate serves more as a statement than a functional asset for the Russian government.
All these renovations suggest that they expect this ghost town to become a major tourist destination. But making money isn't the motivation here.
Of course, it's impossible that Barentsburg one day will support itself, without any funding from the government. It's impossible.
The pivot to tourism isn't just about keeping deep economic roots in Barentsburg. It also serves a purpose of turning Barentsburg into a spectacle for people to see just how much Russian identity is tied to the Arctic. Newly refurbished buildings, new Arctic-themed bars, museums that tell the story of Russian presence in the Arctic. These aren't military bases or airfields, but this sort of projection of culture and identity goes a long way in creating association with a place and exerting influence. It's called soft power. Funding all of this on a faraway island that belongs to Norway is the epitome of soft power. And it's a perfect complement to Russia's surge in hard power in the Arctic. Remember all those dots?
The most long-range air patrols with Bear bombers since the Cold War, 45,000 troops, 3,400 military vehicles, 41 ships, 15 submarines, and 110 aircraft. What do you think Russia's trying to achieve in the Arctic with that massive military buildup?
I don't know. I believe, however, that we're going to have to figure it out.
But up until now, Russia has been playing by the rules on the maritime borders front, following all the UN protocol and making claims in a very orderly fashion. But they've also shown some provocative behavior in protecting their influence in the region.
On the one hand, for Russia to benefit economically from the Arctic, it has to be a stable, cooperative environment. The best thing you can do to spook off economic investment is to think that the region could be prone to conflict.
But we have to remember that this is the government that annexed Crimea a few years ago. It's a government that's not afraid to project power in its neighborhood.
They're showing us both tracks, sort of this dual policy of wanting to be open for business, but be able to growl a little bit and show its muscular teeth for its military. And those two, eventually, they're a little incompatible.
This region is changing fast. The treaties and norms that have kept it in order for years are becoming incompatible with the physical realities. As the ice melts, the region will become more valuable. New borders will be drawn, and new opportunities to project power will emerge. We can only hope that Russia continues to play by the rules.